I'm delighted to introduce Professor Kathryn Davidson, Associate Professor of Linguistics at Harvard University. Her work is on topics including sign languages, bilingualism, language acquisition, language and cognition, and more. And without further ado, please welcome Professor Davidson.
Thank you guys so much. Let me know if you can't hear me or anything, I guess, via chat. But yeah, I want to thank you all for joining this morning. I know I was looking around at some of the posters, and I thought it was a really awesome event. And I saw in a poll we have mostly people in North America, in which case, good morning, and in Asia, in which case, thanks for staying up so late. And I guess also folks on the West Coast for getting up early. So, you know, it's really impressive that you're all spending a weekend doing all of this learning the variety of topics in cognitive science. I think this is such an awesome event. And I guess I get to represent the linguistic side of things. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity. And my goal today is just to give you a sense of some of the topics that I think are really interesting. You know, linguistics, like any of the cognitive sciences, can really take like a broad, very different kinds of approaches to questions and to methods. And today I just want to introduce you to a couple of questions that I think are particularly interesting, even if you're not interested in language per se, but are interesting if you're interested in even larger questions in cognitive science, like, you know, the separation or not of different aspects of cognition in the mind. I'm not going to talk about the brain at all, but I think this stuff translates to questions if you're interested in the brain-mind mapping, that kind of stuff. But in my own research, I mostly study the mind. And focus on languages, but I'm particularly interested in the way that a language is expressed, for example, through speech or through sign and sign languages, and sometimes even linguistic-like expressions and things like gesture. So that's the topic for today. Let me see, I got my slides over there. Right, so before we dive into the sort of linguistic cognitive science questions, I want to give you just a little bit of background. So for those of you who haven't done any linguistics of sign languages, I want to make sure that you understand that sign languages have completely separate linguistic structure from spoken languages, even ones that are very close nearby. So for example, American Sign Language, which is used in North America, and especially in the United States and in English-speaking parts of Canada, and English, spoken English, have actually very little grammatical structure in common. Sometimes they share words like any language is in contact to, but the structure is actually very different. There's a lot of things, for example, in American Sign Language that are shared with, say, Mandarin Chinese. For example, the expression of tense through particles instead of verb endings, or the way that you can drop the subject of a sentence if you know who you're already talking about. These things are in common. American Sign Language has in common with other spoken languages and not necessarily with a spoken language that's nearby. Sign languages have very different grammars from each other. So for example, American Sign Language and British Sign Language also have actually very little structure in common. British Sign Language is from a totally different sign language family tree. And so even though in, say, the UK and in the United States, we both speak spoken English, the sign languages are unrelated. So there's a clear dissociation between spoken and sign languages in different places. They exhibit complex structure at all linguistic levels. So this is a really important thing. So sign languages have all of the same kind of abstract structure, for example, structures of parts of sentences that we sort of have a mental representation for that are made up of pieces at a very sort of abstract level. That happens in speech, and it also happens in sign. This also happens below the level of the sign, which I'm going to talk about in a second, like sign language phonology, all the way to sentence structure. They are acquired and processed just like spoken languages. So for example, children exposed to sign languages, for example, children who have deaf parents, start babbling with their hands. This is really cool work from the early 90s. They go through language acquisition stages that look just like spoken languages. So for example, 1- and 2-word stages, critical period and neural pathways. I wanted to highlight this just because I know the theme of this conference is overcoming adversity, which I think is so appropriate for this year. And, you know, in spoken languages, I think we all of us who use spoken languages have this experience if you try to learn another spoken language, that it's harder the older you are, right? The distribution on this is quite varied. So some people actually find it quite easy to learn a language later in life, and some people find it near impossible. Most of us are somewhere in the middle. But that distribution looks very different than learning your first language, where everybody actually easily acquires your first language. That's what makes linguistics so fascinating and different from, say, I don't know, driving a car, which is also a very difficult, highly complex skill, but everybody seems to be able to learn, or at least doesn't seem to be preferentially good early in life. I mean, there's lots of really deep, interesting cognitive science questions about, is language special in this critical period way, or is it just a good example of the rest of how cognition works? But we know spoken languages happen easily early in life and are much harder to learn later in life. And for a long time, people actually thought that wasn't true of sign languages. So they would sometimes maybe wait to see if a deaf child was going to learn a spoken language, and then if it didn't work out, expose them to a sign language. We now know that is a very not good plan, because sign languages have critical periods just like spoken languages, right? So early exposure to a sign language is the way to learn one very well, right? And sign language learning actually supports spoken language learning. Just like learning one language actually helps you learn more, that's true for a sign language as well. So being exposed to a sign language, especially for deaf children, for whom that's the easiest kind of language input, can help scaffold spoken language learning later, which I think is really fascinating. And if you know something about cognitive science, it kind of makes sense, right? Because neural pathways aren't just about the input. So for example, if you hear a spoken language, first you get input to your auditory cortex, but then very quickly this goes to the language areas of your brain, which is the same kind of thing, for example, the same pathways that you use when you're processing text from reading, for example, which of course don't go through your auditory pathway, they go through your visual cortex, right? But then are sort of passed off to the language areas. The same thing happens for sign languages, right? So you get the input through your, through your visual system, but very quickly it's passed off to your language processing areas. So you can imagine learning a sign language kind of builds up those language processing areas just as much as learning a sign language builds those up just like learning a spoken language, and so it can help scaffold later language learning. So this is a really important area of sign language studies in general. Of my own research, I have lots of interesting, important research in this area. I'm going to talk about a little bit more of an abstract topic today, but I think it connects in a deep way. Like, what do we do in those language areas? What connects sign and speech and text? My own lab is called the Meaning and Modality Lab, because I'm interested in what language modality, how that interacts with more abstract language processing. And finally, I noticed that some of you are here for the more anthropology, cultural, social studies aspects of cognitive science, which I think is fantastic. And there's a lot of richness in sign language linguistics and in deaf studies, connecting the sort of development of languages with deaf communities that are especially organized around deaf schools. So this is not my area of expertise, but I think it's extremely important, and I'm happy to send you references if you want some of the really important work being done in this area. Yeah, you're also welcome to contact me at some point during or after this conference. I love, connecting you to aspects of this that might interest you. What I'm going to talk about today is how, first of all, by exhibiting full natural language is in a different mode. And by mode, I mean, like vision or auditory or textual representation via vision for language. If we get language in a different mode, but yet it still has the same structure, we then looking at it in these different modes really gives us a different way to study what's really fundamental to the nature of human language. So that's the general idea behind the science of sign language linguistics. So one thing that I think is important for people to know is that there's structure below the level of a word. So for a very long time, people interested in the study of sign languages sort of, before they were studying it too scientifically, just assumed that this was like gesture, right? And so one way to see that there's something linguistic about sign languages, even, just coming to it, this was, a lot of this work was done in the 1960s. It was part of the sort of cognitive revolution in general, in cognitive sciences, is to see that actually there's an abstract level. So if I tell you, oh, my daughter is this tall, I say my daughter is this tall or this tall, when I'm gesturing, say to give you some sense of height, intermediate values of that are interpreted, the interpretation is basically analog. So for most gestures, if I'm pointing or giving you a height or saying I caught a fish this big or whatever, and this isn't just for size, could be for emphasis, but gestures tend to be interpreted in an analog way. This is quite different from words and sign languages that use your hands, but are really interpreted in a categorical way, just like words. So for example, this is the sign for onion, right up here. I'll play it one more time. And this is the sign for apple. And I'll play that one more time. And they actually look very similar. So if you don't know anything about sign language, you might be like, oh, I think the one was like a little bit higher up. And that's the right observation to have. But importantly, this interpretation is categorical such that if you sign somewhere in the middle, it's not interpreted as like an onion-apple hybrid or as your own uncertainty about whether it was an apple or an onion. It might be the case that you're not sure which one the person was trying to say. Something like if I say, somebody pronounces the word PIN and PEN similar to each other, you might have a hard time. Are they trying to say pin or pen? I don't know. Say if their category is more similar than your category. So that can happen in this case. But there's not this like expectation that like it's a pen-like pin or something, right? Language is interpreted. We have these categories that we try to map forms onto, and the same happens in sign language too, and that's different from gesture. So there's phonological use of location. So here, the locations on the face are for example, different vowels mapped onto something like different vowels in speech. And this goes for all of the different, so hand shapes, locations, and movements in a sign and sign languages are interpreted linguistically. And there's a ton of, decades of really important, interesting work on this. I should say, if you're interested in studying more about sign language structure, a nice resource is called ASL-LEX, ASL-LEX. So if you Google that, you can look at all these different, it's a resource for people studying sign languages, but you can look at how different signs sort of connect to each other. It's a recent cool database on sign linguistics by some of my colleagues here at Boston University nearby. So there's also morphological. So we're talking about under the level of the word. So for example, we have words like sit, that's a bad example. Like jump and jumps. Like a jump can be a noun and it can also be a verb. We have in sign languages the use of movement can be used to distinguish different morphological classes. So this is a sign for airplane. I'll play that one more time, airplane. And the sign for fly a plane is actually you just make one change to that sign. So it's like a bigger, larger arc to mean fly a plane. So this is the noun form. The verb form is one long arc. Here, this is the noun form for chair. Chair is a noun, right? So this is a noun. Chair. One more time. And the verb sit down is the same thing, but just like with one big movement. So you can see that this like one big movement takes the verb form and these two small movements are the noun form. I'm just trying to give you a sense of the like linguistic structure that you can see very clearly in a bunch of signs in sign languages. Something that becomes really interesting for people like me who are interested in more like sentence level structure is the use of space in sentences and across a discourse. So you might know, so some languages change the form of verbs depending on who does what to whom. English has a little bit of this. Like Mandarin has even less of this, and say Italian has even more of this. So languages can vary a lot, for example, on whether they show subject-verb agreement or add clitics, like in French and in Italian and Romance languages. This is just one of the many, many parameters that languages can vary on. And sign languages actually sort of fall into this area in interesting ways too. So for example, the sign I ask a third person, first person ask a third person is directed away from the body, but a third person asks me is directed towards the body. So you have this change in the form, just like you do for agreement in spoken languages. And it's this use of space to kind of keep track of who's doing what, that it also behaves like a pronoun. So I can say, I ask him or her, so gender is not marked. I ask him or her. In American Sign Language, there are sign languages that do mark gender, but most of them do not. And this is also not common. I mean, in many spoken languages, pronouns don't have any gender marking, so it's not, the lack of that is not surprising. Makes it very convenient, right? I ask someone here. Another thing that's very convenient is that even though there's like gender isn't a category for pronouns, space is. So you can associate different people in a discourse to different areas of space and keep track of them without having to worry about, noun class or gender or anything like this. It's just in the discourse, I could set up somebody here, say, like my mother, point here, my father, point here, she or I ask her, and pronouns or directing verbs to that location uniquely disambiguate that sentence that I'm talking about my mother, say, and not my father. So this is a really interesting aspect of sign languages. It's found in a lot of sign languages of the world. And so part of what I'll be talking about today is trying to understand sort of how to model this aspect of language, right? Which is on the one hand, very linguistic. On the other hand, actually not that hard to interpret. So, even if you don't use a sign language, you do often use space in similar ways, not in exactly this way, but in similar ways when you're gesturing. And so trying to understand exactly how to model the linguistic aspect of this versus the non-linguistics or spatial cognition is one of the questions that I'm proposing today. The other sort of piece of this interesting topic that I want to introduce is the idea that the meaning that is conveyed in language, you can learn a lot by thinking about the logic that underlies that meaning. So I talked about looking at sign language structure since the 60s. Since about the 70s, similar-ish time, philosophers and linguists have been very interested in modeling the messy, sometimes ambiguous human language, right? Sometimes we say sentences and it's hard for people to understand what we meant, or maybe it has multiple meanings. A good example, just last night, one of my young daughters says, "Is it true that that there was once a time when I was the size of my nostril?" The linguist in me, it's cute. The linguist in me thinks it's a really interesting sentence, right? Because on the one hand, yes, there was a time at which you were the size of your current nostril, but it was, of course, never the case that there was a time at which you were the size of your own nostril at that time, right? So that's an example of something that speakers of, say, English, speaker of English will have a strong intuition that there's like two different interpretations of that sentence, and trying to understand why those are both reasonable interpretations of that sentence. And in some languages, actually, you have markers that will distinguish those, so that's not an ambiguous sentence. That's the kind of, those are the kind of sentences that seem to clearly motivate some like underlying logical structure to language. So we bring in tools from precise mathematical logical frameworks, originally things like predicate calculus, like simple predicate logic, first order logic, building up to more and more complex logics. Now we use a lot of lambda calculus structures that many of you might be familiar with from computer science, trying to understand how we can say infinitely many sentences that can be understood, right? So there has to be something compositional because we're expressing things that often are never asked before, right? And that we can learn in a finite time what they mean, right? So it's one thing if you're training things on a huge data set, a human child gets a lot of language exposure, but often not as much as we're training, say, our largest neural nets on, right? So how do we figure out in finite time what new sentences mean? And the answer to this that people in my field of linguistics bring is that we have some kind of like driving logic underlying things that helps us learn. And we can see examples of the nostril sentence, even just like generalizations that you can draw. So if you give a sentence that has a generalization, you can infer lots of things from that. So if I say Alex found every egg in the yard, and I also tell you there are 2 blue eggs in the yard, I didn't actually say this, but you can infer there are some eggs that Alex found. He didn't find only one. I didn't actually say Alex did not find only 1 egg. That exact sentence I haven't said before, but you can evaluate it no problem if you were given these other 2 sentences, right? So the idea is that we try to study what the logical parts of these mean, right? Some and not, and only 1, and every, and 2, and try to figure out how the meaning of that sentence is such that we can infer lots of things that weren't directly said, but that follow, either follow necessarily or follow possibly from those sentences, right? And it is currently, to me, an extremely interesting question, and is currently an open linguistic question, the ways that the discrete aspects of language, so these sort of the logical engine underlying so much of our inferencing about language, how that interacts with continuous representations. This is one of the questions that I find interesting at the sign language, gesture, spoken language interface, right? We have representations that seem to have an analog character. So for example, gesturing height about something, or if I draw a picture, how I interpret the picture, and how does this interact with the discrete representations that seem to necessarily be there in language. So an example that you can see that might seem funny at first is something like the cat was meowing, right? So if I tell you that sentence and I just say it like in that way, the cat was meowing, there's actually nothing depictive in that sentence. Meow, the verb, does, in fact, sound like the sound the cat makes. It does, but it doesn't need to in that sentence. I'm not interpreting it in a pictorial way. I know that meow means the sounds that that cats make. So like, okay, meowing is like an emitting thing that cats do, and I'm telling you that the cat that we were talking about is making those sounds. There's nothing in interpreting that sentence that requires any like analog interpretation. But if I say something very similar, if I say, oh, the cat was like meow, 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 right? So in that case, I'm giving you similar information, but like there's a part of that that's like depictive that seems pretty far outside of language, right? I'm like imitating something, and then you are interpreting my imitation, but it's also like part of that sentence, right? The cat was like meow, meow, meow. And so I have been interested in these kinds of things, not like how do you say the cat was meowing, but interested in the way that we as participants in a conversation integrate the pictorial, like analog representations, imitations, or pictures and things like that with the discrete components that are also very clearly part of language, right? I think you might think that the imitative stuff is actually easy to learn, but there's some interesting evidence that it's not the easiest parts, actually, that it's the kind of stuff that we get later. On the other hand, some of it is very easy, right? Little kids can imitate things quite easy, but integrating the two is quite hard. This comes up in sign languages. I'm just putting this here as like a bit of a citation dump, but in my area of trying to understand formal representations of sign languages, people have noted lots of ways in which things that are like analog or spatial seem to integrate with linguistic elements in sign languages. So for example, I was talking about how you can associate a place in space to somebody that you're talking about, or like my mother, point, and then keep pointing back to that location to refer to your mother. If your mother's actually present, you can actually just point to her, right? And so that seems very familiar from pointing generally. Like 1-year-olds understand pointing like this, dogs understand pointing like this, adults point all the time while we're talking, right? So pointing seems something very broad. In some sense, it is tightly related to language, but we could draw on non-linguistic skills to interpret those points, right? And so it's interesting to try to think about, okay, what's the relation between this clearly linguistic use of pointing that we see in sign languages and the other use of pointing? How do we think about the similarities and differences there? It's also true that in many sign languages that have been studied, you can use other dimensions of space to have quite abstract types of meaning that are expressed also linguistically in spoken languages that we know about. So for example, honorifics. So many languages of the world have honorific systems where, for example, you would use a different pronoun if you're talking about somebody who is sort of in a hierarchical order to you, elderly relatives, teachers, professors, God, things like that, right? You would use honorifics. That's also true in sign languages. So in American Sign Language, for example, you point up to God or to an older brother, things like that. Also, people who are physically tall, which is a very different category, you also point higher to. So like a basketball player, you point up. Unspecific meanings like one likes to read, one likes to read on the banks of the river or something. These are a little bit archaic in modern English, but many languages have dedicated words for that, like in French. And this is not restricted to Indo-European languages by any means. So impersonals are a thing that languages express. And in sign languages, you can also use height in this way for like impersonal, like someone does this. And also when you have big groups, if you sort of associate higher space to a group, the interpretation is that there's more, it's including more and more members and you're not even sure, like anyone versus like the people that I know. And I'm going to go into detail in this in a second because it's work that I'm most familiar with. Existence and non-emptiness in local context. So if something actually doesn't exist, it can be strange to associate it to space in this way. If you have groups, so if you have like a group of all the students and then you want to talk about the first year students, you make that group smaller than the larger group, right? Or if you have like natural pairings, like two couples go to a restaurant, you put the couples or each couple next to each other. So the idea is that there's this very linguistic use of space, but there's also the way that space is used is familiar and seems to draw on spatial cognition in some sense that's a bit outside of language. Some of these are more linguistic, for example, the honorifics and impersonals and White domains. Others seem to just be like how we understand space, right? How we understand the way that groups can be associated to space and how subset, superset relationships work. And so this becomes an interesting challenge to think about how these integrate. So a current way that a lot of people think about this is that that space is equated to something we already know in speech. So for example, something like gender features in Romance languages, that, okay, you have like male and female, like on a noun like table, and that helps you keep track of them. Maybe that's actually the same kind of thing going on with space and sign languages. And you say, oh, but also space has these other properties, right? Like the list that I just gave you. And so we've been trying to work on a different way of thinking about this, where space is in some sense spatial. It just gives you information about space, but then the way that, so in some non-linguistic sense, but then the way that interacts with language is the really cool part, right? So how it contributes to reference. And I can see, it depends a little bit on how you think about the modularity of language versus sort of the non-modularity, and the brain aspect of that can be distinguished from the mind aspect of that. I think that becomes really interesting to think about different levels of representation in the brain and the mind. But understanding how, like, you can have analog, continuous, and discourse-dependent elements come into play from something outside of language, like spatial cognition. So I'm going to connect a little bit outside of CogSci. So one way that this contributes, or one analogy I think that is very interesting, I think I said outside of CogSci, I mean outside of linguistics. So from other areas of cognitive science. So some of you might know about number cognition. This is an area I got interested in a while ago. I still find it really interesting. I feel like if I had a clone, I would study number cognition and numerical structure and language around numbers. Because one thing that we know is that without language, there's quite a lot of numerical processing that you're able to do. So pre-linguistic infants that can't use language at all yet, lizards, all kinds of brains without language are able to process quite a lot about number. So but those are often analog representations. So for example, this amount and this amount, they're kind of hard to see. I just took this as a sort of representative picture from a paper by Lisa Vigenson and her collaborators from about 15 years ago. But the idea is that, like, looking at these blocks, individuals, so pre-language, meaning both in development and in terms of evolutionary development as well, you can look at these arrays and both get sort of rough analog representations of the numbers, the quantities, and this is unlimited. So you can have like a whole array of, say, like 300 dots, and people will have a rough estimate that it's about 3 times as many as 100 dots, even though there's no way you could count that, right? And you can get a flash judgment on that. At the same time, you can also have representations of like individual things up to about 3 or 4, keeping track of like 2 is more than 3, but actually putting those together, and in particular, building up exact representations like 1,703,000, which we couldn't just look at and know using our analog magnitude representations, but we can conceive of and do calculations on that. For example, if I give you a number that big and I tell you to add 1, you know, like, what that means. You know what it means to do that. You know how to figure that out, right? So we have exact representations that are infinite. And there's a lot of evidence that language gives us the ability to do these like infinite exact representations. In language, it seems like we can think about the same thing happening with these representations. Rose, do you need it?
The module clicked OK on the sewing one I'm on.
Can you ask Daddy? I'm in my meeting.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the 5-year-old who asked about the nostril question a little bit ago. So right, what is part of our linguistic knowledge is we can think about the same way, right? So we have the same problem, which is like we have these like analog representations in in number, and we have these exact representations, and like mapping them requires quite a lot of linguistic acquisition. When it comes to these like spatial things in sign languages, and presumably also in gesture, but I actually think there's more work in the sign language domain that speaks to this. It seems like the same kind of thing happens. So for example, we can interpret space, even if you have no experience with sign languages, you can understand how pointing works, and how subsets, supersets, how we understand the structure of space and spatial cognition. It seems like it's a very separate component of our mind. But integrating that with language is actually quite complicated. And in emerging sign language, so this is I recognize you can't see it because it's small, but it's supposed to be a representative diagram from a work by Anne-Marie Kokab and her collaborators looking at Nicaraguan Sign Language, which is an emerging sign language in Nicaragua. There's only about 60, even less, I think, 40 years of development of that language. And what you can see is that at first, there's gestural use of space, just like, again, babies can follow a point. But there's a period actually in the language development where space is in some sense ignored for purposes of keeping track of things. So mother, for example, father in a dialogue are not associated to locations in space. That only comes later. So it seems like there's this sort of independent systems. And then when they try to get integrated with language, it's the integration that's actually the harder later stage. I think that this could potentially really be a similar story to the one that we find for number cognition. And so in my lab, we focus on experimental work, getting sort of using survey methods and psycholinguistic methods to get data from signed and spoken languages, and theoretical work trying to think about how the pieces go together. So in the last section, I just wanted to show you an example of a study that I think speaks to the way that analog content integrates with discrete content in sign language and in gesture for this question of how the two integrate. So quantifiers, if anything, is like this logical structure that you need discrete logical representations for. I think quantification is a good candidate. So remember I said, if we want to understand, if we want to make inferences that go beyond the actual sentence you said, we need a compositional structure and we need some kind of logical engine driving those things. And so in every language that we know of, there's ways to express quantification. These are ways that we express generalizations between sets. So if I just tell you, my dog is licking the puddle, then this is about a specific time and place and individual. I'm telling you about a very specific situation. But if I tell you something like all birds lay eggs, now this is not about a specific situation. This is like a generalization about the world or across many situations. This is, you really need some logical structure to interpret this. In American Sign Language, like in every language that we know, there's ways to express this. American Sign Language has dedicated words for expressing quantificational meanings. So there's all, none, and some, and many others, but these are three that we can start with. These are ways to express quantification in American Sign Language. One thing that is different between sign languages that we know about and spoken languages is that they can very clearly represent the domain information seemingly in an analog way. So this is the data piece that I'm going to talk about for the remainder. So if I say last night I watched a movie with my friends about vampires. I went to bed and I dreamed that everyone transformed into vampires, right? If I say that sentence in English, you have actually at least two or more interpretations of that, of everyone, right? So everyone is very underspecified, right? So everyone, it's not that the logic of everyone is underspecified. It has to be this universal quantification. It doesn't generally allow exceptions. The way you get exceptions or different interpretations is in the domain for that quantification. So if I say I went to bed and I dreamed that everyone transformed into vampires, that could mean like everyone in the whole world, right? It could also mean everybody that I was hanging out with at the party, right? Or any other salient groups that you have that you might have been talking about or that are just salient from the context can serve as the domain for this quantifier, right? In sign languages, this distinctions can be made overt through the use of space. So she's going to say the sentence in two ways. Right, I forget, this one doesn't have the caption, so I'm going to speak them while she's saying them. So she says something like, last night I was watching a movie with friends about vampires. Finished the movie, went to bed, and dreamed, everyone turned into a vampire. And so that everyone was signed up very high. So she's going to do the same sentence, but the everyone is going to be very low. And those have two different interpretations. You might pause for a second and think which one is which. Everyone in the world versus everyone of my friends. Oh, wait, where did it go? This is going to be the high one again. Last night, I watched a movie with my friends about vampires, finished, went to bed, dreamed that everyone transformed into vampires. Last night, I was watching a movie with my friends about vampires, finished, went to bed, dreamed, everyone transformed into vampires. Okay, so it turns out that people have extremely strong intuitions in American Sign Language and in other sign languages, and gestures that high use of space is associated to a wider group. So everyone down here is everyone in the default context. Everyone up here is everyone in a broader context. Note that they're not even like wider signs. This is just as emphatic, everyone who was at the party, right? So that sort of, it doesn't seem that much more emphatic. I know it may be hard to judge that if you don't know a sign language, but it seems like it can be dissociated even from emphasis or from size of the hands. It's really something about the height. It can be expressed just with eye gaze, actually. So it's not necessarily where your hands are, but there's this like association with height as a larger, widened domain, where it's harder to know even who's included, whereas lower is sort of the more exact group, right? So I gave you this example with all in the world, all of my friends. What's cool about this is that it isn't just restricted to the universal quantification. So for none, if no one in my family is deaf, so sign sort of low means nobody in the context, nobody in sort of the default, like my immediate family. If the question is anybody in your family deaf? None. Low is like none in my immediate family. None high is none of my ancestors. Really, there's nobody of a wider group. Note that this doesn't mean literally the whole world. It's not true that nobody in the world is deaf, right? So there's still some pragmatic restriction. This is still a restricted set. It's just a much wider one than the lower version. So it's a relative notion. And here's another example. So the existential quantifier for the logicians here. So someone down low. Here's the context is deciding what condiments to put out at a party. You could say, typically someone likes mustard. And this is a helpful example for those of us who analyze the structure of language, because we even have a quantifier, like typically across situations, generally, someone in the situation likes mustard, and this could be someone at the party versus someone broadly, someone, anyone. And the second one is kind of weird in the context. So people judge this as like, why does it matter that there's somebody that's not even at the party that likes mustard? It's very sort of trivially true. But it's pretty clear that that's the interpretation that you get here. So this seems like a regular use of space. And it seems that it happens across sign languages. So for example, in Nicaraguan sign language, the sign for everyone is all, which sometimes is glossed in a local language like Spanish, which I think is maybe an unhelpful, it's helpful in the local context, but it's unhelpful in the sort of global context, because then you get the sense that there's some like mapping between Spanish and Nicaraguan Sign Language, which is just not true. So everyone here versus everyone in the whole world signed up higher means like everybody in general. This was the same vampire sentence. We're just trying to see if it translated the same expression, the same use of space, right, in sign languages. So people seem to have very crisp judgments in sign languages. This is also true in Japanese sign language. And we just picked this sort of array of sign languages because we had collaborators that we're already working with, working in these different sign languages. But I have our sense, this is collaborative work with Deanna Gagne at Gallaudet University. Our sense is that this probably does generalize, not to just three, because these are three unrelated sign languages. This is everyone down low versus everyone. And so this is everyone sign. It's a different sign across these languages, the sign for everyone, but the use of height seems to be regular. And the natural thing to ask is like, what about gesture, right? Like, do you, if you don't know a sign language, have the same kind of intuition that space is used this way? And so we did production studies in which it seems to be true that in both Nicaragua, Japan, and in the United States, gestures who don't know a sign language do seem to use space. So we gave people these prompts. And we're just asking them to tell us tell us a story, and a lot of people don't gesture. I gesture a lot, but a lot of people don't gesture so much. So sometimes we prompted them with saying, why don't you tell this story without any words, or tell us this story using your hands and your words. And so it's a tricky thing to code, right? So we're working on that. But the general idea is that you do see these expressions sometimes, but they're way less crisp, and they don't seem to correlate as clearly. They're often just in one of the sort of universal contexts, not in the negative, for example, or in the existential cases. So here it's more like the use of the plane instead of like the one height plane instead of comparing heights. So what seems to be very crisp in sign languages seems to be much mushier in gesture, although potentially there, at least a trend that's sort of taken, right? So you can ask, is this like grammatical? Is this a marking in sign language? Is this some kind of like morpheme, like an addition, like a honorific form? This is the domain one in form. In English, for example, we say, do you have some potatoes versus do you have any potatoes? And a lot of people have hypothesized that the difference there is that any is like asking you to consider even more options, that any is a form of the word, some that makes you think more broadly. And so you might think that the same thing is happening in sign languages, that like we have these forms that make you think about more broader examples instead of just your default, right? And what we came to a conclusion about, which I feel very cool, is that you can express this. It's part of the pronominal system in sign languages. And so, without pronouns that work the same way in gesture, you're not going to get this like, linguistic use, like, for example, with the negative quantifiers. One way you can see this is that some quantifiers you just can't move because for phonological reasons, like it's just weird to pronounce them higher and lower. So all is easy to do in ASL, and none and some, but few is a quantifier that has like a lot going on with it in ASL. It just like already has this internal movement in the hand in a particular place. And so it's hard to like move it up. Few people find that very weird, but it actually goes very nicely with the hypothesis that the height is really part of a pronoun, because for few, you get this, you can express the same interpretation of like few of them versus few more. If you say few of my family versus few of them, in the context of my family goes to the beach every year, a few of them get sick. This could be a few of my family that I was talking about, or a few of generally the people at the beach. And what moves there then is the pronoun, not the quantifier. So our hypothesis is what's happening in the something like all is that it's really all of them pronounced together, and it's the of them part. So this is how you can see like the analog part being incorporated into the language, in this case I think via pronoun. I'll skip over that example, but one other, so this is how like a linguistic mind works, right? So I think, okay, if it is on a pronoun, where would we not expect to see this use? And nouns don't have pronouns like in them, right? So like dog. So a lot of verbs and quantifiers, it's a reasonable thing. So a quantificational expression like all of them has a pronoun in it, right? Even if you just say everyone, it's really like every one of them. Even if you're not saying it overtly, the meaning is like there's a domain built in there. And for verbs, often you express verbs with, not in English, but in many other languages, you can put the pronoun and you can put, like, say, the subject and the object like into the verb. But you don't do that with nouns. And it turns out that in sign languages, you don't use this use of height with nouns. So it's a reasonable thing to try to express, like, I want a dog, any kind of dog, right? Like, I want a pandemic puppy, I want a dog. And you can express that, but you don't use height in this way. So you don't say, like, I want dog. Doing this, everybody that we worked with, all the native signers are like, oh, that's like if it means anything, it's like a dog is up high on a building or something. It doesn't mean any dog, right? To say that, you have to say dog, I want some, where some is signed up high. So some is a quantifier, and it would be like the domain is wide. But dog, the noun, doesn't like combine with the domain, it seems like. So I think that was a cool piece of evidence. And I mentioned verbs also. So this is something that isn't familiar from English, but would be familiar if you know lots of other languages of the world. So where you're expressing the subject and object like in the verb. And so there's lots of verbs in sign languages. I mentioned this earlier, that like ask that are like this. Inform is another one. So you can say, I inform you broadly, or like you all inform me, or one of you informs me. So inform inform, the verb changes its form depending on the subject and the object, and like does not. So like doesn't move around or change its form in American Sign Language depending on the subject and the object. And what you see is that you can say like, I like that group, I inform that group, and you can do the same thing with the verbs. You can say I inform hi, like a wide group, meaning like all of them. And so in a place where there's already evidence that there's a pronoun, it seems like you get the same kind of thing. You just had the same use of height. Here's an example I'll show you. It's the end of the world. The government has a special boat ready. And this is like a Noah's Ark type scenario. And they're choosing who can go on it. Those who have been picked high up are responsible for bringing their stuff. The government is just providing the boat. We're trying to come up with examples where you could imagine like a verb like pick from, but out of everyone or out of a really wide group. Pick from is another verb where you're changing the form depending on the arguments of the verb. So here's the example. Oh yeah, I think the captions aren't the subtitles aren't turning on here, but here he says, everyone pick from. And this means like pick from a broad group. And here is the same one, but pick from a lower group. So there's pick from down low, and the interpretation is that you're picking from a known set, right? So this I think is very nice. Example where you don't even have a quantifier, you have a verb. So where initially it looked like quantifiers do something interesting in sign languages, really it seems like it's actually the pronoun system that does something interesting. And that when you have verbs like inform that like have a pronoun go with them, or a verb like pick, it's really like pick of them. And so this not only gives us some insight into like what's going on with height, I think it gives us some insight into what's going on with these kind of verbs. It gives us some more evidence that you really have like a verb and a pronoun. This is just like clitics attaching to pronouns that you might be familiar with in Romance languages. This really doesn't happen in English, so we don't really have a pronoun going on a verb in English, but it is a common strategy in general in languages of the world. And it seems like you get the same distribution in other sign languages. So gather is a verb in Japanese sign language. Pronouns and quantifiers all seem to express this use of height. This is collaborative work. I think I have them on some of the slides, but not on this one, with Kazumi Matsuoka and Yuiko Yano at Keio University. So I'm going to wrap up this part and say there's evidence for the domain information coming from the pronoun in lots of different ways. So in one sense, this seems to be treated like other features on pronouns, like in English, gender like he, she, number, me, us, or he, them, person, first and third, right? So there's different things that you can put in pronouns across the world's languages. And it seems like this is something that can be in pronouns in sign languages, right? On the other hand, like it isn't arbitrary, right? It's something that we can we have some access to even without knowing a sign language, right? So trying to figure out what it means to put this as part of the meaning of pronouns in sign languages. Hopefully you can see both where the insight and where the challenge comes from, right? It's a consistent use of height across verbs, quantifiers, even in non-signers pantomimes, but with sort of a broader grammatical possibilities in sign languages than in gesture, where it doesn't seem to be attaching in any regular way to a particular like word or meaning. So we have all these, this is just one, this is the widened domain example, but there's lots of places where we see this like non-linguistic or something that's spatial and that we have some access to without language, but then becomes really highly integrated into the grammar in a very sophisticated way in sign languages, right? So I think that integration is very, I hope at least that you can see where the problem has a negative connotation, where the interesting puzzle comes in, right? How we understand both, how we capture how much we know about, say, spatial cognition with the much more complicated structures that we see in language. The last thing, I know I can wrap up, but I thought maybe We'll just give you a taste of like one other area where this comes in. So, because it's kind of fun. So I'm not going to go through an analysis. I'm just going to show you 2 slides of what they look like. So there's verbs in sign languages. I showed you a bunch of things about pronouns, but there's a whole class of verbs in sign languages that give you information not just about who did what, but like about where and exactly how they were positioned. These are called classifier predicates. So Christine Sun Kim is a very well-known artist who is a deaf native signer of American Sign Language. And she is talking about her exhibition, which was on a, not her exhibition, her, she had her artwork on a huge billboard right next to the Highline Museum, right next to the Highline Park, which is next to the Whitney Museum in Manhattan. And she's talking about, she's using a very like regular part of the grammar of sign languages just to describe the spatial relationship between, basically, she's talking about the park and then the billboard. She's telling you like where it was with relation to the park, right? But this is, we might, for example, if I'm speaking in English, I might kind of go like this while I'm talking to express something about this use of space. In sign languages, these are highly integrated into the grammar so that these function as verbs. There's lots of diagnostics. You can see how they integrate with negation, with quantifiers. They're very verbal structures, which at the same time are conveying very detailed information about space, right? And so I think there's been psycholinguistic work which is extremely interesting, coming out of, for example, UC San Diego, looking at how deaf signers and hearing non-signers interpret the components of classifiers, and they are equally good in some sense at the spatial part, but very differentiated in the hand shapes, which are linguistic in every way. And so this is a case where you have, it's not just like I showed you before, like pronoun integrating the spatial information. Here you have a verb which has both a sort of spatial analog component and a very clearly linguistic component, the hand shape, which has to basically agree with arguments. And so, what we can do is give like a very detailed logical representation that puts the burden of interpreting that analog stuff outside of the linguistic system by saying, oh, we can demonstrate things just like the cat was like meow, meow, meow. We can say, this was like this, right? So the idea is you have a demonstrative expression essentially inside that you go out and bring into the language in the way that we know language already does, say through demonstrative like pronouns like this. So I think I will wrap up there. I have a few more slides if you want to ask me about them, but I figured we wouldn't think of this anyway. So yeah, that is work showing that bilinguals, so people who are growing up equally with sign and spoken language, when they blend with like the pronouncing speech that includes both sign languages and spoken languages, those classifier things that I was talking about seem to be expressed in speech with like vocal mimics, right? So the idea is if you're trying to integrate your expression in both of these languages, it's evidence that language really does take in analog components, even when it's embedded in a very sort of complex logical structure, which I see is really the interesting problem, especially from cognitive science, right? Like how do you integrate into a larger spatial language and other aspects into an integrated whole? It seems like quite the challenge. So I want to make sure I highlight my collaborators on some of this work, especially Deanna Gagme, who's the main collaborator on all the height work, who's a professor at Gallaudet. Well, thank you guys very much for the opportunity to share this information. I'm happy to answer questions, both in this context and generally. You can get in touch with me by looking at our website.
Oh yeah, thank you so much, Professor Davidson, for an awesome talk. Like, we've learned so much about sign languages and other like interesting aspects involved in it. And we will jump into some Q&As that are in the section. So the first question asks, since sign language can transmit information in more analog ways, do you think it would be easier for an artificial intelligence or chatbot to learn this over English?
What a great question. The training data is really hard, right? So yeah, right. Like I think probably it wouldn't be easier, but I don't know that much about how artificial systems, like there's the whole problem of like visual scene processing, which there's so much work on, but there's also so much more to do. And integrating that with language, I think that's the challenge, right? And I think in theory, maybe there would be some advantages and some disadvantages there. I think in practice, there's a huge amount of disadvantages, which is that the sign language corpora aren't coded, right? So it's hard to know exactly what you're training it on, right? There's not like great coded sign language corpora, and there's just like a lot less data out there to feed in than there is, for example, in spoken language corpora. So I think it's an extremely interesting question. I mean, there's a real need. A lot of cog sci people in the past have tried to, like engineers and things have tried to make, try to do cog sci with sign languages in ways that just like aren't helpful for deaf people. For example, like sign language gloves, you can read a bunch of links on the internet. Just Google like, are sign language gloves helpful? And you got lots of links showing like, this is not that helpful to deaf people. Nobody actually wants this. But like great AI to parse sign language corpora is actually very needed. It's just very far away, right? Because like, what's the training data and like how are we parsing that? I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff there, though. I don't think it'd necessarily be easier because it has all the problems from visual processing, but maybe a greater need from using those insights. So it could be really interesting integrative work. I like that question. Thanks.
Thank you. So move on to the next question. Does English speaker has better ability in learning ASL comparing to, for example, Korean Sign Language or any sign language from regions that use different verbal language, or are they unrelated?
Yeah, so this is another like theory practice difference. So in theory, it's pretty unrelated, right? Like the grammar is just totally separate, but there's a lot of language contact. So in that sense, like, let's say, if you think of two spoken languages that are genetically unrelated but are spoken next to each other, there could be some advantages, and especially also like users of one will be more familiar with like people learning. So there's a lot more understanding and like expected mistakes that people are used to if you're, for example, coming from English to American Sign Language versus like English to, say, Korean Sign Language. I myself know American Sign Language the best, but I have definitely know a lot of people who say are first language speakers of English but learned another sign language first. And I think my like understanding is that it's the similar challenges. It can be very then hard to like separate your two sign languages. That is a common challenge. Then if you try to learn like ASL or ASL and try to learn Korean Sign Language, it's kind of like advantages and disadvantages. It's like, okay, you grow up as a native speaker of say Mandarin and English, and then you go learn Spanish and then also Italian. It can be like hard to separate them. It's that kind of a challenge if they're related. There's not a lot of work on second language sign language learning though. So most of the questions in there are still open questions. But my first response is it's not that much easier. Just people are more understanding because you're going to make more expected mistakes.
Yeah, thank you. Moving on to the next question. Do you think there are more differences in ASL compared to spoken language within different cultures?
Yeah, it's funny. Linguists, I think, have a bad tradition of dissociating language from culture too much, right? And I think in recent times, like we understand language and culture goes very tightly hand in hand, right? And sign language, American Sign Language is a collection of languages, just like English is a collection of languages, right? It's like there's lots of different ways to speak English. There's lots of different ways to sign American Sign Language, and so right, you're like. I think there's a lot of cultural overlap, though, of course, because American Sign Language is like embedded in the same U.S. culture that U.S. English is. So there's a lot of shared things there too. Email or, I don't know, expectations of honorifics. Some of those things are going to be much more shared when you share a culture. So for example, I know Japanese Sign Language incorporates a lot of similar sort of honorific things that spoken Japanese does, which makes a lot of sense, right? Although my understanding also, and I'm not an expert, is that it's a lot less so. There's a lot fewer honorifics than there are in spoken Japanese, which is interesting. So it doesn't necessarily have to map one-to-one, but of course when you have a shared culture, you have shared linguistic aspects, right? And that's a thing that linguists aren't always good at understanding, but linguistic anthropologists are very good at reminding us of.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question says, does sign language that represents things in same category, like for example, car, truck, bus, automobile tends to be similar in sign language as well?
Yeah, right. I don't know if you knew the answer to this already or like heard a little bit about this, but that is true. So there are lots of languages in the world that have noun classes. Bantu language family in Southern Africa is one of those. But not only like nominal classifiers in some East Asian languages are like this too, right? So you have, right, like long skinny things or vehicles or adult humans, right, or like classes that get their own morphemes. In spoken languages, I mean, English does not have that as much, and sign languages tend to have a lot of that in the classifier system. So vehicles have a special hand shape, and long skinny things have another special hand shape, and small animals and upright humans. So those noun categories that you might find intriguing from different languages of the world are also present in a lot of sign languages in the classifier predicate system. And there's, on the one hand, we know a lot about those. On the other hand, like the cognitive science of those, I think, is still understudied. There's some cool work I just saw last spring by a grad student in a lab at MIT, psycholinguistics, who was doing some cool work on Mandarin classifier psycholinguistics. And I was thinking it would be neat for us to do some of that in sign languages too. So yeah, lots of interesting work there. That's a great question.
Yeah, thank you. So now we have our last question, which is, how does research look like in the field of linguistics, especially in the study of sign language? For example, like, does it involve lots of participants?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's changing, right? So for a long time, it was just like a lot of linguistics, which is like, I'm going to interview a speaker about what you can and can't do, and, you know, write things down. We just ran a study just last week, like an online study. We were using Prolific Academic, which is in spoken language work in my lab when we're studying English, Spanish, German. We use Prolific Academic, which is a way to like hire people to do a quick task. And so you can use big data for that. For languages that have smaller groups, like American Sign Language, it tends to work better to recruit people through social media. But we did have 85 participants in our last study, which I thought was great, all within 1 week, recruited and paid well, because it's quite an expertise skill to be a give us, you know, your linguistic knowledge about American Sign Language. So yeah, we're moving in the area of like bigger studies, but it's always a challenge. And I think I at least come with a bias that we shouldn't disregard studies that only have a small number of participants, like 5. I think there's a lot of insights. It would have us disregarding a lot of really interesting language work if we only focused on big data. But I think we're thinking about collecting larger judgments in sign languages these days, just like in spoken languages, because we can understand more about variation, and there's tools to do it. And everybody's sitting in front of their computers these days anyway, so it's a little bit easier to recruit people. So it is moving in that direction, but at least the linguist in me wants to say, don't, you know, disregard the really important work that's documentary work done with, say, 3 speakers of a very underrepresented language, right? But yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk about that, because I think it's an interesting question. And linguists, the field is changing, but maybe more slowly than in, say, psychology.
Yeah, thank you for that. So that's it for the questions. And Professor Davidson, thank you again for such an amazing talk.
Yeah, thanks for this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. We all really appreciate it. We all enjoyed your talk. And yeah, so thank you so much for coming out to speak to us.
Have a great rest of the conference, everyone.
Thank you.